Family, breathe. Just breathe for a moment. You've been carrying so much, trying to hold everything together, trying to make sense of what feels like a whirlwind around you. But I hear God whispering something right in the middle of that storm you've been wrestling with. Relax. Everything will come to you. Not because you're perfect, not because you figured it all out, but because He's already gone ahead of you. He's aligning things, shifting things, preparing things, and even preparing you. You don't have to chase what God has assigned. You don't have to fight for what's already been written in your name. This is the season where God is calling you to exhale, release the pressure, and trust that what's meant for you is already on its way. You're not behind. You're not forgotten. You're right on schedule for a God who's never late. When God releases a promise over your life, it doesn't come wrapped in anxiety, urgency, or fear. It comes wrapped in assurance. The problem is that life often teaches us to believe that if we're not fighting, pushing, striving, stressing, or forcing outcomes, then things will fall apart. So when God speaks a word that says relax, it almost feels irresponsible. It feels counterintuitive because we've been conditioned to hustle our way into worthiness, to grind our way into breakthroughs, to prove something to ourselves or to the world. But God's promises don't operate in the same system as the world. When God speaks a promise, He's not basing it on your strength. He's basing it on His sovereignty. He's not checking your resume. He's checking your heart. He's not watching your pace. He's watching your posture. And sometimes the greatest act of faith is to stop striving and simply believe that what He said is already unfolding, even when you see no evidence yet. Panic is a natural response when we feel out of control, but faith is the supernatural response that reminds us we were never meant to control every detail. Think about how many nights you lost sleep over something that eventually worked out anyway. Think about how many times you feared the worst, only to watch God turn things around in ways you couldn't have orchestrated. Panic narrows your vision, but God's promise widens it. Panic keeps you stuck in survival mode, but God's promise invites you into trust mode. When you panic, you start grabbing at anything just to feel secure. But when you trust, you allow God to place the right things in your hands at the right time. Some of us panic because the promise feels too big. We look at where we are and then we look at what God said, and the gap feels intimidating. That gap is where many people lose their peace, but the gap is also where God does His greatest work. The gap is where He builds character, heals wounds, breaks cycles, strengthens discernment, and aligns your identity with your destiny. The promise doesn't need your panic. It needs your cooperation. It needs your willingness to grow into the person who can carry what God intends to deliver. You don't ask a child to drive a car because the car is ready, but the child is not. In the same way, God doesn't withhold promises to punish you. He holds them until you're ready to manage them. Sometimes panic shows up, not because we doubt God, but because we don't trust timing. And timing can feel like the most brutal part of the journey. Waiting can feel like stagnation. Silence can feel like abandonment. But God operates outside time and yet works within time for our sake. The promise already exists. You're simply walking into it step by step. The same God who spoke your beginning already knows your ending. The delay you feel is not disorder. It's divine pacing, slowing you down so you don't outrun grace. When you panic, you start trying to micromanage God. You start creating backup plans for His plans. You start settling for what's available instead of what's appointed. But every time you settle out of fear, you step away from the fullness God intended. Panic says you have to make it happen. Promise says God will make it happen. Panic drains you. Promise sustains you. Panic makes you reactive. Promise makes you expectant. And that expectancy is what God wants you to carry, because expectancy keeps your spirit open, your faith active, and your vision lifted. God's promise over your life is not fragile. It can withstand your fears, your doubts, your tears, and even your moments of weakness. What it cannot coexist with is the belief that everything depends on you. This is the season where God is calling you to shift from panic to peace, from striving to surrender, from rushing to resting, from controlling to releasing, because his promise is stronger than your anxiety, his word is louder than your worry, and his plans are bigger than anything you could force on your own. When God invites you to rest, he's not asking you to be lazy, passive, or disconnected. He's calling you into a spiritual posture where your spirit becomes sensitive enough to hear what your busyness kept drowning out. Rest is not inactivity. Rest is alignment. It's the place where God can speak to you without competing with the noise of your anxiety, your deadlines, your pressure, or the expectations you've placed on yourself. So many of us keep praying for clarity, breakthrough, direction, and healing, but we're trying to receive heavenly instructions while our minds are running at earthly speed. Rest slows you down enough for your spirit to catch up with what God has been trying to tell you. When you rest in God, you create space for revelation to settle, for wisdom to rise, and for truth to anchor itself inside you. There are moments in life when God will intentionally quiet the room, slow the pace, and shut down the distractions because he knows you've been moving too fast to hear him clearly. Rest becomes the divine reset. It's where old fears lose their grip. It's where new vision begins to form. It's where your heart finally becomes tender enough for God to speak to those deep areas you've been avoiding. Some revelations don't show up while you're running. They show up when you finally sit still. When you pause long enough to breathe, you start to realize that the same God who is orchestrating the promise is also orchestrating your preparation. But rest is hard when you've spent years learning to survive by staying busy. Some of us use busyness as a shield because if we keep moving, we don't have to confront the wounds, memories, or truths we've been pushing down. Rest forces stillness, and stillness forces honesty. It reveals what the noise kept hiding. And sometimes the most powerful revelation God gives you is a mirror. He shows you who you became just to cope. He shows you the version of you that learned to function in fear, the version that built walls instead of boundaries, the version that worked overtime just to feel worthy. Rest becomes the place where God gently begins to peel back those layers so he can reveal who you really are underneath all the survival habits. Revelation doesn't rush. God speaks to the heart that is willing to listen, not the one trying to outrun discomfort. When you rest, you create margin for God to rewrite the stories you tell yourself. You create space for your identity to be shaped by truth rather than trauma. You create room for conviction to replace confusion, for peace to replace pressure, for discernment to replace desperation. Rest becomes sacred because it allows you to hear God without the distortion of panic or the interference of exhaustion. A tired mind will misinterpret signs. A weary heart will misread God's timing. A burned out spirit will confuse delays for denial. But when you rest, revelation clears the fog and aligns your perspective with God's reality. There are doors you've been pushing that weren't even meant to open yet. There are opportunities you've been chasing that weren't crafted for your assignment. There are relationships you've been trying to hold together that God has been trying to release you from. In rest, God reveals which battles are yours and which burdens never belong to you. You start realizing that not every good thing is a God thing. Rest sharpens your discernment so you can differentiate between what's meant to bless you and what's meant to drain you. This is why the enemy hates your rest. He knows that a rested believer is a dangerous believer. A rested believer hears God clearly. A rested believer stops settling. A rested believer refuses manipulation. A rested believer becomes anchored, stable, alert, and spiritually awake. Rest is where your strength returns, your vision expands, and your confidence is restored. It's where you stop reacting out of fear and start responding out of wisdom. It's where revelation flows freely because your spirit is no longer distracted or depleted. God is calling you into a deeper kind of rest. not the kind where you simply sit down, but the kind where your soul unclenches, where your mind stops rehearsing worst-case scenarios, where your heart stops bracing for impact, where you trust that you don't have to keep everything together for God to move. In that place of rest, revelation becomes effortless because you're no longer fighting the process, you're flowing with it. There comes a moment in every believer's journey where the delay feels personal, where the waiting feels heavy, and where the silence feels like rejection. It's in those moments that the enemy whispers, if it was really for you, it would have happened by now. But the truth is, delay has never been God's way of saying no. Delay is often his way of building the foundation strong enough to handle the weight of what you prayed for. God is not denying you. He's developing you. He's protecting you from stepping into something prematurely, because premature blessings can become burdens. What looks like a pause to you is actually a preparation period in heaven's timing. When we see delay, we assume something went wrong. But when God delays, something is being made right. There are pieces being arranged, hearts being softened, connections being positioned, and spiritual doors being opened that you can't see yet. Delay doesn't mean denied, it means divine timing is still unfolding. Sometimes God delays because you're not ready for the magnitude of what you asked for. Sometimes he delays because the people connected to your blessing aren't ready yet. Sometimes he delays because the environment you're stepping into still needs to shift to sustain you. The delay isn't punishment, it's precision. The enemy uses delay as one of his favorite tools to tempt you into discouragement. He wants you to believe that God forgot you or changed his mind about you. He wants you to think the promise expired or that you missed your window. But God is not limited by time, and he doesn't operate with deadlines the way we do. Your blessing is not late, it's layered. It's unfolding through seasons, shaping you as it forms itself. If you received everything you prayed for instantly, you'd never develop endurance, resilience, wisdom, or gratitude. The waiting room is where God builds spiritual muscle, emotional maturity, and a deeper dependence on him. Delay reveals your heart. It exposes whether you wanted the blessing or the one who gives the blessing. It reveals whether your faith is anchored in God or anchored in outcomes. It shows whether you trust his plan or only his pace. So many of us say we believe God until he says, wait. We say we trust him until he challenges our timeline. We say we surrender until he asks us to release our urgency. But faith that can only function on your schedule is not faith yet, it's convenience. God allows delays to stretch your faith, not to break it. What you think is a setback is actually a setup for a stronger version of you that can sustain the promise you're walking into. Sometimes God delays because the version of you meant to receive the blessing is not the version of you standing here today. You're still evolving. You're still shedding old identities. You're still healing wounds that would sabotage the very thing you're asking for. God won't give you something that blessing you but breaking you at the same time. Delay becomes his mercy. Delay becomes his protection. Delay becomes the evidence that he loves you too much to let you settle for a moment when he's preparing a lifetime. There are blessings with your name on them, but the you who opens them must be healed, whole, wise, and anchored enough to carry what comes with them. Look back at your life for a moment. Think about how many times you were grateful later for something you didn't get sooner. Think about the relationships that ended and made room for something better. Think about the opportunities that slipped away only for God to bring one that fit perfectly. Delay often doesn't make sense until you're standing inside the promise, looking back at the season you once cried over. What you call delay, God calls design. What you called waiting, God calls working. What you thought was denial was simply him aligning the right moment with the right miracle. Delay doesn't mean denied because God's timing carries a wisdom that your emotions don't have. He sees the whole picture while you're focused on the moment. He knows what's coming, what needs shifting, what needs healing. and who needs to be positioned before your blessing can arrive. He's not withholding, he's orchestrating, not punishing, preparing, not breaking you, building you. And when the moment finally comes, when the door opens, when the promise manifests, when the blessing arrives, you won't call it late. You'll call it perfect. There is a version of you that God is shaping behind the scenes, a version of you that is stronger, wiser, softer in the right places, firmer in the places that once collapsed, and more aligned with the destiny he designed long before you ever breathed your first breath. At the same time, there is a blessing with your name on it that God is also preparing. And the reason it hasn't collided with your life yet is because God refuses to give you a blessing that your present identity is not ready to carry. He loves you too much to let you mishandle something sacred. So while you're asking God to speed up the blessing, God is slowing down the process so you won't sabotage what he's been setting up. He prepares the blessing, but he also prepares you. We imagine that blessings arrive fully formed, but blessings arrive calibrated. They are created to fit the healed version of you, the anchored version of you, the version of you that survived storms and came out with spiritual muscle. You may think you're ready, but God sees the cracks in the foundation that need reinforcing. He sees the old patterns that still need breaking. He sees the insecurities that would turn a blessing into a burden. Preparation may feel like delay, but it is God pouring strength, wisdom, and identity into your spirit, so the blessing becomes sustainable instead of temporary. God is not preparing blessings that will crumble under pressure. He's preparing blessings that will carry legacy. That's why the process feels intense at times. That's why relationships shift. That's why certain opportunities fall apart. That's why doors you wanted to open remain locked. God is shaping the environment around you and the environment within you at the same time. He's pruning connections that would drain the blessing. He's removing distractions that would distort discernment. He's closing doors that would cause you to settle beneath your calling. Everything that leaves, everything that pauses, everything that shifts is part of the divine preparation for what's coming. There are seasons where you feel God's hand on your life tightening, stretching, pressing in places you thought were already healed. But God is not exposing wounds to embarrass you. He's exposing them to free you. He's bringing up old patterns so they don't follow you into a new season. He's confronting old fears so they don't sabotage new opportunities. He's refining your voice, your character, your confidence, and your clarity so when the blessing shows up, you walk into it as the person who can protect, nurture, and maximize it. God prepares the blessing, but he also prepares you to steward it well. Many people want the blessing but don't want the preparation. They want the platform without the pruning, the abundance without the alignment, the miracle without the molding. But preparation is where God teaches you the language of your next season. It's where he strengthens your spiritual stamina. It's where he deepens your discernment so you can recognize counterfeit opportunities and unhealthy connections. Preparation is where God teaches you to hear his voice above your fears. Without preparation, blessings become overwhelming. With preparation, blessings become purpose-filled. There is a reason certain prayers take time. There is a reason certain dreams feel distant. You're not waiting because God is ignoring you. You're waiting because God is constructing something that fits the future version of you. You're being shaped for the assignment as the assignment is being shaped for you. The job you've been praying for is being aligned with the wisdom you're developing. The relationship you desire is being matched with the healing you're embracing. The opportunities you dream of are being synchronized with the confidence God is building in you. And here's what's beautiful: nothing is wasted. Every tear, every delay, every closed door, every moment of stretching is contributing to the person you're becoming. God is the kind of father who prepares thoroughly. He won't give you anything halfway formed or halfway aligned. He prepares the blessing in its fullness, and he prepares you in your fullness. And when both preparations meet at the appointed moment, everything will make sense. There is a kind of peace that doesn't make sense to people who haven't lived through the storms you survived. It's not the peace that comes from everything going right. It's the peace that shows up even when everything looks uncertain. It's the kind of peace that confuses the enemy because he expected you to fold, to break, to run, to quit. But instead, you stood still with a calm that didn't come from your own strength. This is why peace is spiritual warfare. Every time you choose peace in a situation designed to steal your joy, you are making a declaration in the spirit that you refuse to be moved by fear, pressure, or chaos. You're saying, I know who holds my future. I know who fights for me. I know who speaks for me. I know who goes before me. Peace isn't passive. Peace is power. The enemy thrives in environments of anxiety, distraction, and emotional overload. He loves when your mind is racing, your heart is overwhelmed, and your spirit feels unanchored. Because when you're in that state, you're more vulnerable to lies, doubt, and confusion. But when you choose peace real, God-breathed peace, you shut down his access points. Peace becomes a shield. Peace becomes a filter. Peace becomes a boundary that darkness can't cross. The enemy can strategize, but he can't penetrate a heart guarded by the peace of God. This is why Scripture says peace surpasses understanding. It outperforms logic, emotion, and circumstance. It becomes your spiritual armor, but peace doesn't come automatically. It's something you choose and protect. You protect it with boundaries. You protect it with discernment. You protect it by refusing to let everyone speak into your spirit. You protect it by being intentional about the voices you allow near you. Some people can't handle your peace because they are addicted to chaos. Some environments can't sustain your peace because they thrive on dysfunction. Part of walking in spiritual maturity is recognizing what disturbs your peace and being willing to step back from it, even if stepping back is uncomfortable. Protecting your peace is not selfish, it's stewardship. God often brings peace before he brings answers. Peace is the evidence that he's already in the situation. Peace is the confirmation that he's already working behind the scenes. Sometimes God quiets your spirit before he changes your circumstances because he wants you to know that external change is not the source of internal calm. He wants you anchored in him, not anchored in outcomes. When you learn to stand in peace while the storm is still raging, you stop being intimidated by delays, setbacks, or uncertainty. You become unshakable. The storm doesn't shrink, but your confidence grows. The chaos doesn't disappear, but your spirit rises above it. Peace is spiritual warfare because it refuses to let fear control your decision-making. Fear will have you shrinking back from opportunities God created for you. Fear will have you settling for less than your calling. Fear will have you thinking small, playing small, living small. But peace reminds you that you are held. Peace reminds you that you are guided. Peace reminds you that you are protected. Peace gives you clarity. And clarity is dangerous to the enemy because clarity exposes lies. Peace gives you strategy, and strategy disarms confusion. Peace gives you strength, and strength silences intimidation. When you walk in peace, you shift atmospheres. You walk into rooms differently. You make decisions differently. You pray differently. You navigate conflict differently. Chaos no longer has authority over you. Anxiety no longer dictates your reactions. You stop responding emotionally to things meant to provoke you. You start responding spiritually. That's when the enemy realizes he can't control you with the same tactics. He can't shake you with the same storms. He can't distract you with the same fears. You've matured into a version of yourself that understands peace is not a feeling. It's a weapon. This is why God is calling you into a deeper level of peace in this season. Not the surface peace that depends on everything being perfect, but the rooted peace that comes from knowing God is perfect even when life is not. A peace that stays steady, a peace that stays grounded, a peace that keeps you centered and focused. a peace that whispers, God is here, and God is working, and God is not finished. Peace is not the absence of trouble. It is the presence of God in the midst of it. And when you choose that kind of peace, you don't just survive the battle, you win it before it even begins.